Welcome to Building Count Measures that Enumerate Events. In this lesson, we'll explore how to create count measures that enumerate events. These measures count things like office visits or inpatient admissions. Before we walk through creating an event-based count measure, let's take a moment to review the timeline period temporal structure, which is associated with this type of measure. This temporal structure is used when a measure's denominator represents a period of time, like a month or a quarter. For example, imagine a measure that counts the number of nephrologist office visits per month. The measure's numerator is the number of office visits that occurred within the month, and the measure's denominator equals 1 for each month reported. Let's quickly review this measure, count of monthly ED visits, to explore how measures that count events are presented in Analytics Portal. Like most measure types, the results are displayed as a run chart by default. This measure's results are presented on a monthly basis. If I click on any of these months, information about the month is presented below. Immediately to the right of the measure's value is its presentation as a fraction. Here we can see the numerator is the count of events, and the denominator is 1, which represents the month in question. Now if I go back and highlight 3 months of results, then the information presented below the chart is for all 3 months. Here we can see the denominator is 3, the count of 1 for all 3 months in question. This is the actualization of the timeline period theory that we were just discussing. The numerator is the count of events for the period in question, which in this case is a month, and the denominator is the count of 1 for each of those months. Let's go to Measure Workshop to recreate this measure. We'll start by selecting the plus sign icon in the upper right corner of the screen. This will redirect us to the New Measure screen, where we can select the Count of Event End template to create a new count measure. When we select the template, the associated form appears, and we can start specifying the measure. As you can see, the form does not have a section for defining denominator parameters, as this measure will not have a denominator object to configure. First, we'll specify the numerator base object that we want to base our count of events from. We are going to select the claims-based ED visits object that we've used before. After specifying the object, Ursa Studio inferred the case ID, which is the field or combination of fields that identify unique records in the object. The system made the correct inference. The encounter ID is the proper field to use for case ID. Ursa Studio also correctly inferred the effective date for the numerator event. We are creating a measure that counts the number of ED visits and assigns those ED visits to monthly periods. The effective date, ED visit start date, specifies which period the events should be assigned to. The duration unit is where we actually specify the duration of the periods. That is, we define how long the period within which the number of ED visits are counted. We could count daily, weekly, monthly, or by any of the other choices listed in this dropdown. So when we specify the duration unit, we're telling the system how often to tally the count of ED visits. The measure name is already specified, so next we enter the measure's nickname. We can use monthly count of ED visits. Next, we'll specify the measure ID, the short, easy-to-recognize identifier for the measure. We'll use ED-P01 to indicate this measure is associated with emergency department analytics and will be considered a count of a population. Last, we'll specify the measure's domain. The measure domain is a way of categorizing measures based on their purpose. Count measures fall under the population domain as they report the population of entities or events. Now we have the opportunity to preview the measure's specifications before creating it. After completing the template, we are redirected to the Measure Properties windows. We'll need to update the measure name and measure description fields and then confirm the measure name is correct as it was initially auto-generated by the system. It's fairly standard to use the measure's nickname for the measure's name and description when working with count measures. Lastly, we'll want to click on this check mark to confirm the measure name is correct. The count measure option is checked, which is what instructs the system to only present a numerator stack. You may notice that the component class option is not available here. This can also be attributed to the fact that this is a count measure and does not have a denominator stack. Because count measures have a one-to-many relationship between denominator and numerator observations, they all have a long-form component class. The measure's temporal structure was specified as timeline period, and the case ID is set to encounter ID. Both of these specifications were made using the template. Another common configuration option that is not presented is the dominant case option. This option is available to measures with denominator and numerator stacks. It enables the specification of what the stack's case end users are most likely to consider the measure's case. With count measures, the dominant case is clear. It's the case ID associated with the numerator. As this is a measure where the numerator is the dominant case, we need to specify the ranking field. We'll use the ED visit start date for this option. We'll also set the ranking direction to descending so that the most recent visits are listed first. You can see that most of the necessary configurations were made by the template. As you probably remember, the numerator and denominator contributions panel is where you can specify how the measure's numerator and denominator are calculated. The numerator contribution uses an if-then logic to specify that when the encounter ID field is not blank, then count 1. Otherwise, count 0. This ensures that all valid records are counted towards the numerator's value. The denominator contribution for timeline period measures establishes a period within which numerator events are counted. At the beginning of this lesson, we dug deep into the timeline period theory, so I won't rehash those details. But it is worth noting that for every month-long period found in the data, the denominator count is 1. Let's take a quick look at a few of the options in the Measure Metadata panel. Count measures use the Poisson distribution. The Measure Range option is set to count, and the Measure Unit is set to number. If you ever create a measure that counts events without using the template, these are the metadata options you'd want to select. Before saving this measure, I'd like to point out one more panel to keep in mind when building this type of measure. The Event Effective Dates panel is found on the measure stack. The panel only has one option, which is the Event Effective Date field, where you specify which date column from the object contains the date of the event being counted. This field is what indicated to Ursa Studio which dates should be contained within which months. As you can see, this field was specified using the template, but it is important to keep in mind if you build a measure without using the template. Now we can save the measure. Once it's saved, it's ready to be added to a report. And that's it. You now have the knowledge needed to create count measures that enumerate events over time. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.